Hey, brilliant people. So it's been a minute, and one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you today was to talk about why things are so crazy right now. Yeah, so it's been a minute. I still have been here. If you send me messages or comments, I'll still get them and respond to them. But of course, my life, just probably like your lives, gets a bit crazy at times, and now definitely seems to be one of those times. And I don't need to get into personal stuff, but I wanted to talk about why things are so crazy right now. I mean, the world has been through crazy periods before, so why are we going through one now? Well, there's a couple of ways of looking at it. If you really want to understand what happens when things go through a big shift or transformation, you may be interested in having a good read of Ilya Prigoghine's work. We've just heard who won all the Nobel Prizes. Well, back in the day, Ilya Prigogine won for his work in biochemistry, talking about dissipative structures, which actually gives us a framework to understand transformation. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But essentially, the sort of cliff notes are that when systems go through a big shift, well, obviously that's uncomfortable because we don't always know what's going to happen on the other side, and that creates a bit of chaos. And because as humans, we tend to be very easily scared by the unknown. So that makes the process of changing like even more kind of crazy making. Right, so let's look at how things go through a transformation, what the stages are. So the first stage is that the current system, whatever it is, just gets more and more stressed. So most systems can actually handle a bit of stress, like your own system, like your financial system. You can probably cope with a bit of stress, whether that's just finding the money to pay for something like Christmas or whatever. Like you've found a way to handle those kind of stresses. But of course, if there's stress after stress after stress, eventually the system starts to break down. And of course, that's when we tend to freak out, because when the old system starts to break down, well, what are we going to do? So when the old system breaks down, there's three possible outcomes. So the first possible outcome is that it just keeps breaking down. Entropy wins, it all just goes back to like an unstructured mess. There is no system left. The second option is that it actually goes back to the way it was. Like somehow or other, the system manages to pull together enough energy to put itself back together. The third option is that the system actually restructures, finds a new template, finds a new way of being or operating, and that becomes then the new system. So if we look at society as a system, one of the stresses, funnily enough, like when we look at history, I'll start there. So when we look at history, most of the big changes, whether you look at the beginning of the Dark Ages or the beginning of the Renaissance, I mean, they were both changes. There were similar things that were going on. There was climate changes, and some of those climate changes resulted in famine, which resulted in mass migration. There was technological changes. So all of these things combined, oh yes, and of course plagues, forgot plagues. How could we forget plagues? So all of these things combined to put stresses on the social system. And of course we've got, we get the winning ticket. We've got all of them going on at once. So that puts a lot of stress on our current social system. And particularly one of the stresses is actually this thing that you're watching me on, is social media, the internet, because a lot of our old social systems were reliant on our various cultures or tribes or our various social groups being isolated in one way or another. So we never got to see how other people lived their lives. So we could make rules about, well, you're supposed to live like this or like that. But now, of course, because we are so connected, we are so open to realizing all these different ways of living and that they're all fine. But that is putting a lot of pressure on the old social structure that we've grown up in. And as a consequence, that old structure is starting to break down, that whole hierarchy. And of course, so it is possible that things will just continue to break down. I hope not. But there becomes a point at which things have gone too far. Things have gone too far and the system can't pull itself back into the old system. And personally, I believe that that's where we've gotten to. So there's, if you look around the world, the rise of conservatism. I obviously can't say that fast. Yes, and conservatism that is taking the form of fascism. These things are attempting to pull our society back, into how things were like 100, 200 years ago. But it's just not going to work, because in order to do that, we'd actually have to go back into that kind of system. Like we'd have to go back into isolated states. And of course, we have seen some countries that are going towards this extreme conservatism that is fascism, attempting to isolate their countries. And of course, in a very interconnected world that has a lot of negative outcomes. So it might work for a while, but it won't work in the long term. So essentially, we have gone past the point at which I believe we can pull the system, or the system can be pulled back into those very sort of hierarchical, our way is right, their way is wrong kind of way of running our society. So what are we left with? If we can't go back to the way things were, we're left with the whole system breaking down entirely, which would be, if you like, the beginning of a new dark age, or that things restructure and we find as a society a way to work with those differences that's actually positive for everybody. Now that might sound like fairy tale stuff at the moment, but that is actually possible. It's called interdependency. It's just that humanity doesn't know how to do interdependency, not on a social scale. I have talked about that in other videos. I will continue to talk about that because that's what I believe that we all need, and that the sooner that we realise how to do that, I believe the sooner the craziness will settle, because we will actually have a clear template of where we're going, and so we won't need to be as freaked out about the unknown, because it won't be unknown anymore, because we'll know how to do interdependency. And of course, that will mean that we will remember that we're brilliant.